Paul insists that Christ is the goal, the essence, the underlying, and the overarching substance of the law of Moses. We've heard him say it over and over. Why is this? Very simply, because Christ is the Word, the Logos. And while since the mid-3rd century, the Bible has been expanded, at least for Christians it has, to include the New Testament, prior to that time, no such thing existed. Only what we typically call the Old Testament. So, when Yeshua and the apostles Paul and John and all the others referred to Messiah as the Word, the only entity they knew as God's Word was the Old Testament that included the law of Moses. Listen to John 1, 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and all things came to be through him, and without him nothing had been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of mankind, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not suppressed it. Jumping to verse 14. The Word became a human being, and he lived with us. And we saw his glory, and the glory of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And just to make clear his personal position on the continuing relevance of the law and the Old Testament prophets during his famous Sermon on the Mount, Christ said this in Matthew 5:17 through 19. You've all heard this 100 times in here, if not more. Do not think I have come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to complete. Yes, indeed, I tell you that until heaven and earth passes away, not so much as a jot or a stroke will pass from the Torah. Not until everything that must happen has happened. So whoever disobeys the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys them and teaches them will be called the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I'm going to tell you with just the little tiniest bit of a devilish pride that as I have led tour groups to Israel, I have asked many unsuspecting pastors to read those words aloud while the tour group visited the Mount of Beatitudes. And I have watched as a deer in the headlights look come across their face. The pastors realized what they had just said. And it is as though being in that place somehow made it come alive, made it real to them for the first time. And it opened their ears to hear and comprehend something that they had never understood before. For some of them, it lifted a huge burden. For others, it caused them to be faced with a very painful choice. Stick with the purely man-made doctrine of the law is dead and gone for believers in order to satisfy their denominational leadership, or believe what Christ plainly said at the very spot they were standing. Now, you can make that same choice exactly where you're sitting, and I think you know what you ought to do. But will you? You know, I can assure you that if you're still wavering, to believe Christ in this will lift a huge burden and set you off on a path to a much stronger and more beautiful relationship with Him and His Father than you ever imagined.